Hi everyone and welcome to this video where I'm going to explain what handle an exception means. As usual, I'll try to use an easy language to explain this important concept in Java programming. And as usual, I'm going to provide you with effective examples to explain this concept. The topics. Firstly, we are going to understand how to decide how to handle an exception. We'll see that there are three ways to handle an exception. And so we'll understand which of them is useful in a specific context. So we'll see the theory behind the handling of exceptions, and we'll see the keywords involved in handling an exception. After that, we'll see the three ways to handle an exception. So we'll see that there are three ways to handle an exception in Java. The first one is delegating the calling method to handle the exception. The second one is completely handle the exception in the current method. And the third method is partially handle the exception. So we'll see that we can partially handle an exception and delegating the calling method to handle the exception for the remaining part. Okay, let's start with the first topic. Here we are going to understand how to handle an exception. The first thing to do when we are going to handle an exception is to ask ourselves, in the current method, do we know what to do when an exception occurs? Okay, we have three possible answers to this question. No, yes, partially. If the answer is no, it means that the calling method is delegated to handle the exception. So it means that in the current method we are not able to handle the exception, and so we can send the exception back to the calling method. In the calling method, in turn, we will ask ourselves the same question. The second possible answer is yes. That means that we are able to handle the exception in the current method, so we know what to do if an exception occurs. That means that the calling method will never know that an exception occurred in the current method. We can put together these two ways to have the third method to handle an exception. If we partially know what to do when an exception occurs, we can handle the exception in the current method, but also send the exception back to the calling method so that it can handle the exception for the remaining part. In turn, in the calling method, we'll ask ourselves the same question we asked before. Okay, let's move on and have a look at the keywords involved in handling exceptions. So, if the answer to the question is no, so we don't know how to handle an exception in the current method, we use the keyword throws. This keyword makes the exception to be sent to the calling method. If the answer is yes, it means that we are able to handle the exception in the current method. So we'll use a try block with a catch block. And so, as said before, the calling method will never know that an exception occurred in this method. If the answer to the question is partially, we can use a try block followed by a catch block to handle the exception in the current method, but also we will use the throw statement to send the exception to the calling method so that the calling method will be able to handle the exception. The first way to handle an exception is by delegating the calling method to handle the exception. It means we don't know how to handle the exception in the current method. So since we don't know what to do, we delegate the calling method to do so. We have to understand how to send the exception back to the calling method. And there are two different ways depending on the type of the exception. If the exception is a checked exception, we will use the throws keyword. If the exception is an unchecked exception, we will use no keyword. Okay, in the first case, so if the exception is a checked exception, we will specify the throws clause in the method definition. In this case, the read all lines method throws an IO exception if a problem occurs while reading a file, and this exception is thrown to the calling method by the throws clause. The throws clause followed by the type of the exception to be sent to the calling method. Okay, so let's go to our development environment and open the delegate_check.java file. Okay, in this little snippet of code, the readAllLines method can throw an IO exception if there are some problems during the reading of this file. Since we are not able to handle this exception in this method, the exception is thrown by the throws clause to the calling method. The calling method is main because the main method called the myMethod method. Okay, I'm going to execute this little snippet of code in the debug mode so we are able to see the execution step by step. So I'm here at line number 9. I execute line number 9. Another step on and I enter the myMethod method. I execute now line number 15. And now, since the unexisting.txt file is not existing on my PC, I will receive an exception. This exception is not handled in this method, and so it will be thrown in the main method, which is the calling method. So I go a step on. I will receive an IO exception. Actually, I have a no such file exception, but no such file exception is a subclass of IO exception. Okay, so here I can see that the exception was created in the readAllLines method. This exception was thrown in the myMethod method, and this exception in turn has been thrown to the main method. So as we can see, we didn't handle the exception in the myMethod method, and so the same exception has been thrown to the main method, which is the calling method. We can see in the source code that the throws clause is mandatory because since the IO exception is a checked exception, is it's mandatory to handle it, and so we need to specify the throws clause because this is our way to handle this exception here. If the exception thrown is an unchecked exception, we don't need to specify the throws clause. That's because the unchecked exceptions is not checked at the compile time, so we don't need to specify the throws clause. Here we can see that my string variable is null, and so we receive a null pointer exception if we attempt to invoke the length method on the variable myString. this exception, this null pointer exception, is sent to the calling method without the throws keyword because the null pointer exception is an unchecked exception. Okay, let's go back to the development environment and have a look at delegate unchecked.java file. Okay, in this little snippet of code, we have the variable myString that is null. And so here I'm going to invoke the length method on a null reference. Also here I'm going to execute this little snippet of code in debug mode, so we are able to look at the execution step by step. Okay, I execute line number 5, then I enter the method, execute line number 11, line number 12. Now I'm going to execute the line number 13, and here I will receive a null pointer exception. Okay, here we have a null pointer exception generated in this my method. And since we are not able to handle it in this method, the same exception is thrown to the main method. Okay, uh, as we said before, we don't need to specify the throws clause in the method definition. For an unchecked exception, specify the throws clause is optional. So this program works the same way than the previous one. Okay, but it's a bad practice not to specify the unchecked exceptions in the method definition. So the right way to make things done is this one without the throws clause specified in the method definition. Okay, so if we don't know how to handle an exception in the current method, we can use the throws clause to send the exception back to the calling method, and so the calling method will decide how to handle it. Or if the exception is an unchecked exception, we don't need to specify the throws clause, and the exception, in this case the null pointer exception, will be sent automatically to the calling method. Okay, if we do know how to handle an exception in the current method, we can use a try block followed by a catch block. So in this case, in the try block, we'll put all the statements that can generate an exception. So for example, here, the read all lines method can throw an exception, so we put it in the try block. So in the try block, there are all the statements that can generate an exception. In the catch block, we are going to put all the statements that must be executed if the exception occurs. Okay, so let's go to the development environment and open the complete handling checked.java file. Okay, so here we have the read all lines method, and we know that this method can throw an IO exception. But here we are able to handle the exception, so we know what to do if this exception occurs. And so we put the statement read all lines into the try block, and we put the this system out statement in the catch block. In the catch block, we put all the statements that needs to be executed if an exception occurs. Okay, also here I'm going to execute this little snippet of code in debug mode. Okay, I execute line number 9, then I jump into the my method, and here I am at line 17. An existing .txt file does not exist on my PC, so if I go a step on, I will jump into the catch block. Okay, so this system out statement is not executed because the exception because when the exception is thrown, the execution jumps directly into the catch method. Here I can execute the line 20, so this message is printed to the console, and then I can go a step on, and I go back to the calling method. Okay, and here you can see that the end string is printed. That means that the calling method uh, does not know that an exception occurred here. Okay, so with the try block and the catch block, we are able to completely handle an exception. Nothing changes if the exception is an unchecked exception, so we can handle this exception by a try block followed by a catch block. And so here, trying to invoke the length method uh, will cause an null pointer exception because my string is a null reference. And so the execution will jump directly in the catch block. Okay, let's see it on the development environment, and let's open the complete handling unchecked one.java file. Okay, so here we have my string that is a null reference. And on this null reference, we are going to invoke the length method. So execute the little snippet of code in debug mode. Line number 5, we jump into the method. We are now at line number 14, so my string is null. If I go a step on, I will jump directly in the catch block. And if I execute this statement, this message will be printed to the console. Another step on, I will jump back to the calling method, and as we can see, the program ends normally, and that means that the calling method does not know that an exception occurred in my method. Okay, yes, we can handle an unchecked exception the same way we handle the checked exception, so with a try block followed by a catch block. But this is a bad practice, so handle an unchecked exception with a try block followed by catch block is considered a bad practice because usually unchecked exception are programming errors in our code, and so it's a best practice to provide additional code to prevent this exception to be thrown. Okay, so the proper way to make things done is not to use the try block followed by the catch block, but for example to use an if else. So we are going to invoke the length method on my string only if my string is not null. Okay, so let's go back to the development environment. So this is the bread practice, uh, handling an unchecked exception with a try block followed by catch block. This is the right way to make the handling of the exception. So we provide additional code to prevent this null point exception to happen. And here we can see that we will invoke the length method on my string, on the my string reference, only if my string is not null. In this case, since my string is null, if I execute this little snippet of code, I will receive this error message printed to the console because my string is null. So you can see that here we don't have an exception handling. We are not handling an exception. Simply, we are providing additional code to prevent the exception to happen. Okay, the third way to handle an exception is to partially handle the exception in the current method and throw the exception back to the calling method to make the calling method handle the exception for the remaining part. So here we can see that we use a try block followed by catch block. In the catch block, we provide the additional code to handle the exception. And as the last statement in the catch block, we use the throw statement to throw the exception back to the calling method. Obviously, since we are throwing to the calling method and a checked exception, we need to specify the throws clause in the method definition. Okay, let's see it with an example on our development environment. Okay, here we have the read-onlines method that can generate an IO exception. So since this read-onlines is in the try block, if an exception occurs, the exception will be caught by the catch block. So this statement will be printed and the exception will be thrown to the calling method. The calling method is the main method. And since we are throwing a checked exception, we need to specify the throws clause here in the main in the method definition. Okay, let's execute this program in debug mode. So we are at line number 9. Number 10, we jump into the method. We execute the read-onlines, and it will generate an exception because the existing.txt file is not existing on my PC. So we jump into the catch block. So this line is not executed. This line is executed only if the read-onlines don't generate an exception. So we handle the exception here by this statement, and then we throw the exception back to the calling method, so to the main method. And here we can see that the exception is generated by the read-onlines method. This exception is thrown to the my method, and the my method throws the exception to the main method. So here we are handling the exception partially here and partially in the calling method. In this case, the calling method uh, that doesn't handle the exception, so it throws the exception back to the calling method, but there's no calling method for the main method because the main method is the entry point of our application. Okay, the video is over. Thanks for watching. For further useful videos, don't forget to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and of course on YouTube. Thanks for watching.